In the marble corridors of Renaissance Florence, where power shifted like shadows and fortunes were made and unmade with a single word, there lived a truth that would echo through centuries. Those who master themselves master the world around them. This is not merely philosophy, but the hardest of practical wisdom, distilled from the crucible of human ambition and the unforgiving theatre of power. The year was 1513 when a disgraced diplomat, stripped of his position and exiled from the very city he had served, began to write what would become one of history's most profound meditations on power. Niccolò Machiavelli, sitting in his modest cottage outside Florence, understood something that escaped the princes and potentates of his time. The greatest victories are won not on battlefields but within the silent chambers of the human heart. Consider the scene unfolding in the Palazzo della Signoria that fateful autumn morning. Duke Cesare Borgia, known throughout Italy as Il Valentino, stood before a room filled with his enemies. They had come expecting to see him broken, defeated by the sudden death of his father, Pope Alexander VI. The vultures had gathered, sensing weakness, ready to tear apart his carefully constructed empire. Yet, as they entered that chamber, something in Borgia's demeanor stopped them cold. He stood with perfect stillness, his face a mask of serene confidence. When his chief rival, Giuliano della Rovere, launched into a venomous tirade about his illegitimate claim to power, Borgia simply listened. His breathing remained steady. His hands, clasped behind his back, showed no tremor of anger or fear. When della Rovere finished his verbal assault, expecting rage or desperate pleading, Borgia spoke with the measured tone of a man discussing the weather. "Your Eminence speaks with great passion," he said, his voice carrying no trace of emotion. Passion, however, has never built lasting kingdoms, only temporary storms. The room fell silent. In that moment, watching Borgia's unshakable composure, each man present felt a chill of recognition. They were looking at someone who had achieved something they had not: complete mastery over his own emotional nature. This scene illustrates the first great principle of emotional sovereignty. The person who cannot be provoked cannot be controlled. Every emotion we display becomes a lever that others can use to manipulate our actions. Anger, fear, desperation, even excessive joy, all become weapons in the hands of those who understand human nature. But the individual who maintains perfect emotional equilibrium becomes unpredictable, unreadable, and therefore unbeatable. The transformation from emotional reactivity to emotional mastery is perhaps the most profound journey a human being can undertake. It requires nothing less than the destruction of one's weaker self, that collection of impulses, fears, and desires that have governed us since childhood. This destruction is not violent but surgical, not bitter but liberating. It is the methodical dismantling of every internal mechanism that makes us vulnerable to external manipulation. In the courts of medieval Europe, there existed a class of individuals known as the grey men, advisors who seemed to possess no personal ambitions, no visible weaknesses, no exploitable desires. Kings and emperors relied on them precisely because they could not be bought, threatened, or seduced. What made them powerful was not their wealth or connections, but their complete emotional detachment from outcomes. They had successfully killed their weak selves and emerged as something far more dangerous: truly free human beings. The weak self manifests in countless ways. It is the executive who raises his voice when challenged, immediately revealing his insecurity. It is the negotiator who shows her desperation through nervous gestures, handing victory to her opponents before discussions even begin. It is the leader who takes criticism personally, transforming every policy debate into an ego battle. These individuals may achieve temporary success, but they carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Consider the contrasting example of Elizabeth I of England, who understood intuitively what Machiavelli would later articulate systematically. When the Spanish Armada threatened her shores, her advisors expected her to show the feminine weakness that her enemies assumed she possessed. Instead, she appeared before her troops at Tilbury wearing armor, her voice steady as steel as she declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." But it was not her words that moved those soldiers. It was her absolute calm in the face of existential threat. She had long since destroyed the part of herself that sought approval, that feared death, that craved comfort. What remained was pure will, uncontaminated by the emotional turbulence that destroys lesser rulers. The Spanish saw this composure and recognized something that chilled them more than any army: A leader who could not be broken because she had already broken everything within herself that could be exploited. The process of destroying one's weak self begins with the most radical act imaginable: complete honesty about our own nature. Most people live their entire lives without ever conducting a truly ruthless inventory of their emotional vulnerabilities. They remain strangers to themselves, victims of impulses they neither understand nor control. The path to emotional sovereignty demands something far more difficult: a willingness to examine every fear, every desire, every point of pride or shame that governs our behavior. This examination is not pleasant. It requires acknowledging that much of what we consider our personality is actually a collection of defensive mechanisms developed in childhood. The need to be liked, the fear of confrontation, the compulsive desire to prove ourselves. These are not character traits but weaknesses that can be systematically identified and eliminated. Take the case of Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to Louis XIII of France. In his youth, he was known for his quick temper and wounded pride. These traits nearly ended his career before it began, as he made enemies of powerful nobles who could have destroyed him. But Richelieu possessed the rarest of qualities: the ability to see his own flaws clearly and the determination to eliminate them completely. He began a program of what he called internal reformation. Each morning he would spend an hour examining his emotional responses from the previous day. When had he felt anger? What had triggered his pride? Where had fear influenced his decisions? Then, with the systematic approach of a scientist, he would design exercises to eliminate these responses. When nobles insulted him, he trained himself to feel nothing. When his policies were attacked, he learned to respond with cool analysis rather than defensive emotion. The transformation took years, but its effects were profound. By the time Richelieu reached the height of his power, he had become something unprecedented in European politics: a man who could not be manipulated through any emotional appeal. Kings feared him not because of his armies, but because he was utterly predictable in his rationality and utterly immune to the emotional pressures that controlled everyone else. This immunity to emotional manipulation creates a form of power that extends far beyond politics. In every human interaction, from the boardroom to the bedroom, from the marketplace to the battlefield of family dynamics, the individual who maintains perfect emotional equilibrium holds decisive advantages. They see clearly when others are blinded by feeling. They think strategically when others react impulsively. They remain focused on long-term objectives when others are distracted by immediate emotional gratification. But perhaps most importantly, they inspire a peculiar form of respect that borders on fear. There is something deeply unsettling about encountering a person who cannot be emotionally manipulated. It forces others to abandon their usual strategies of influence and confront the uncomfortable reality that they are dealing with someone who operates by entirely different rules. The second part of this transformation involves understanding that emotional control is not emotional suppression. Many people mistake stoicism for numbness, calm for indifference. This is a fundamental error that leads to a different kind of weakness. True emotional mastery involves feeling everything while being controlled by nothing. It is the ability to experience the full range of human emotion while maintaining complete sovereignty over one's actions. A master of emotional control feels anger but chooses when and how to express it for maximum effect. He experiences fear but uses it as information rather than allowing it to paralyze his decision-making. She feels love and desire but refuses to let these emotions blind her to reality or compromise her judgment. This is not the path of the emotionally dead, but of the emotionally enlightened. The historical record is filled with individuals who understood this distinction. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his Meditations during military campaigns that would determine the fate of the Roman Empire, describes not the absence of emotion, but its proper governance. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. He felt the weight of empire, the sorrow of loss, the burden of command, but he refused to allow these feelings to compromise his judgment or cloud his vision. Similarly, the great Japanese swordmasters developed not emotional numbness, but emotional clarity. They trained themselves to feel fear in combat while acting with perfect precision, to experience rage while maintaining flawless technique. They understood that emotion, properly channeled, could enhance performance rather than degrade it. The key was never to let emotion control action, but to let disciplined action harness the power of emotion. This principle extends to every arena of human endeavor, The surgeon who operates on her own child feels love and terror but channels these emotions into surgical precision. The businessman negotiating a deal that will determine his company's survival feels pressure and anxiety but uses these emotions to sharpen his focus rather than cloud his judgment. The parent disciplining a beloved child feels pain and doubt but maintains consistency because long-term love requires short-term emotional discipline. The weak self wants immediate emotional relief. It seeks to express every feeling as it arises, to react instantly to every provocation, to choose comfort over effectiveness. The destroyed weak self has learned that the highest form of self-respect involves accepting emotional discomfort in service of larger objectives. It understands that the person who can delay emotional gratification indefinitely possesses a form of power that can reshape reality itself. This understanding leads to the development of what ancient texts called the observer self, the part of consciousness that watches emotional reactions without being controlled by them. This observer notices anger arising and thinks, "Interesting. I'm feeling anger now. How can I use this information?" It feels fear and asks, "What is this fear trying to tell me about the situation I'm facing?" It experiences desire and inquires, "How can I channel this energy toward my larger purposes?" The observer self never judges emotions as good or bad, but treats them as data to be processed by intelligence rather than impulses to be obeyed by habit. This creates an internal separation between feeling and action that is the foundation of all genuine power. The person who has achieved this separation cannot be controlled by others because they have achieved complete self-control. In the great trading houses of Renaissance Venice, there existed merchants who possessed this quality to an extraordinary degree. They could watch their fortunes rise and fall with the tides of commerce while maintaining perfect emotional equilibrium. When good news arrived, they neither celebrated nor relaxed their vigilance. When disasters struck, they neither panicked nor despaired, but immediately began calculating their next moves. Their competitors, driven by greed when winning and fear when losing, made predictable mistakes that these masters of self-control exploited with surgical precision. They bought when others were selling in panic and sold when others were buying in euphoria. Their emotional detachment allowed them to see market patterns that emotion-driven participants could never perceive. Their wealth grew not because they were more clever, but because they were more disciplined. This same principle operates in every competitive arena. The poker player who has destroyed his weak self feels the excitement of a good hand and the disappointment of a bad one, but never allows these emotions to alter his betting patterns or change his facial expressions. His opponents, reading their own emotional reactions in his face, make increasingly costly mistakes while he accumulates their chips with mechanical precision. The chess grandmaster experiences the thrill of discovering a brilliant combination and the frustration of realizing she has made an error. But these emotions never rush her into premature moves or cause her to abandon sound positional principles. Her emotional discipline allows her to see the board clearly when her opponents are blinded by their own hopes and fears. The military commander feels the weight of sending soldiers to their deaths and the elation of victory, but never allows these emotions to cloud his tactical judgment or compromise his strategic vision. His troops follow him not because he is fearless, but because his fear is always subordinate to his mission. These examples illuminate a crucial truth. Emotional mastery is not about becoming inhuman, but about becoming more effectively human. It is about achieving the full potential of human consciousness rather than remaining trapped in its primitive, reactive patterns. The person who has destroyed their weak self has not eliminated their humanity but refined it into its most powerful form. The third and final transformation occurs when emotional mastery becomes so complete that it transforms not just the individual but their entire environment. This is the phenomenon Machiavelli observed in his most successful princes. Their inner calm created outer order. Their emotional discipline inspired discipline in others. Their unshakable confidence became a kind of gravitational force that drew loyalty, respect, and obedience from all who encountered them. When an individual achieves genuine emotional sovereignty, they begin to operate according to different laws than those governing ordinary human behavior. They become immune to the emotional contagion that spreads panic through crowds, that turns reasonable people into mobs, that transforms minor disagreements into violent conflicts. Their presence alone can stabilize volatile situations, simply because they refuse to participate in the emotional escalation that fuel chaos. History provides dramatic examples of this phenomenon. During the London Blitz, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, remained in Buckingham Palace despite nightly bombing raids that could have killed them at any moment. Their decision to stay was not mere symbolism but a profound exercise in emotional leadership. By refusing to show fear, by maintaining their normal routines in the face of mortal danger, they provided an anchor of stability that held British morale steady through the darkest period of the war. The effect was measurable. In neighborhoods where the royal couple made appearances, civil defense functioned more effectively, evacuation procedures proceeded more smoothly, and panic-driven behaviors decreased significantly. Their emotional discipline created what psychologists now call a calm field, a zone of stability that influenced everyone within its range. They had achieved something that no amount of propaganda or military might could accomplish. They had used their inner mastery to reshape external reality. This same phenomenon operates on smaller scales throughout human society. The parent who maintains perfect calm during family crises creates children who are more emotionally stable and resilient. The teacher who refuses to be drawn into classroom chaos gradually civilizes even the most unruly students. The manager who never loses emotional control during business crises inspires confidence that prevents organizational panic and enables clear thinking under pressure. But the most profound transformation occurs in the realm of personal relationships. The individual who has destroyed their weak self no longer seeks emotional validation from others, no longer needs to be right in arguments, no longer requires constant approval or reassurance. This liberation from emotional neediness paradoxically makes them far more attractive to others. People are drawn to those who seem complete in themselves, who offer stability rather than demanding it, who give from strength rather than taking from weakness. This creates what ancient philosophers called the paradox of detachment. The more emotionally independent one becomes, the more others seek to form emotional connections with them. The person who needs nothing from others finds that everything is freely offered. The individual who demands no loyalty inspires fierce devotion. The leader who claims no special privileges finds that others voluntarily grant them authority that could never be taken by force. This paradox operates because most human beings live in a state of emotional scarcity. They seek constantly to fill internal voids through external validation, to heal old wounds through new relationships, to find in others what they have never developed within themselves. When they encounter someone who radiates emotional completeness, who seems to need nothing, who offers stability without demanding reciprocity, they are drawn like iron filings to a magnet. The emotionally sovereign individual does not manipulate this attraction but simply allows it to operate according to its natural laws. They understand that genuine power lies not in forcing others to submit, but in becoming the kind of person to whom submission feels like privilege. They create loyalty not through threats or bribes, but through the simple demonstration that they are worthy of loyalty. Consider the example of Winston Churchill during his wilderness years in the 1930s. Politically isolated, mocked by his contemporaries, dismissed as a warmonger and a has-been, he maintained absolute confidence in his vision of coming events. While others celebrated Chamberlain's peace in our time, Churchill continued his lonely warnings about Nazi Germany with unshakable certainty. His emotional discipline during this period of rejection and ridicule was perhaps more important than his leadership during the war itself. When events proved him right and Britain desperately needed leadership, Churchill did not gloat or demand apologies. He simply stepped forward and began the work of saving his nation. His years of emotional training in the wilderness had prepared him for this moment of supreme test. He could inspire courage in others because he had conquered fear in himself. He could demand sacrifice from his people because he had already sacrificed his own need for popular approval. He could promise nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and have millions follow him because they recognized in him something they had never seen before, a leader whose strength came from within rather than from external circumstances. The transformation from emotional reactivity to emotional sovereignty is not achieved through willpower alone, but through a systematic program of internal development that can be learned and practiced. It begins with the cultivation of what the Stoics called the discipline of perception, the ability to see events clearly without the distortion of emotional projection. Most people do not see reality, but only their emotional reactions to reality. The undisciplined mind interprets neutral events as personal attacks, random setbacks as cosmic injustices, ordinary human behavior as deliberate provocations. The discipline of perception involves training oneself to see what is actually happening, rather than what one fears is happening or hopes is happening. This requires developing the ability to separate facts from interpretations, observations from judgments, present realities from past conditioning or future anxieties. It means looking at every situation with the detached curiosity of a scientist rather than the heated involvement of a participant. When someone criticizes your work, the disciplined perception asks, what specific information is being conveyed? What underlying concerns are being expressed? How can this feedback be useful? The undisciplined mind immediately jumps to, they're attacking me. They don't appreciate my efforts. They're trying to make me look bad. One response leads to learning and improvement. The other leads to defensive reactions that preclude growth. When a business deal falls through, disciplined perception inquires, what factors contributed to this outcome? What can be learned from this experience? What adjustments need to be made for future negotiations? Undisciplined perception creates stories. They were never serious. We were treated unfairly. The market is impossible. One response leads to strategic adaptation. The other leads to emotional paralysis. When a relationship ends, disciplined perception examines what patterns emerged, what needs were unmet, how did both parties contribute to this outcome. Undisciplined perception assigns blame. They were selfish. I gave everything and got nothing. Love is a waste of time. One response opens the path to better relationships, the other closes it. The second element of systematic emotional development is the discipline of desire, learning to want what happens rather than demanding that what you want happens. This is perhaps the most radical shift in human psychology imaginable. Instead of constantly battling reality when it fails to conform to preferences, the emotionally sovereign individual finds ways to align with reality while still pursuing meaningful objectives. This does not mean passive acceptance of undesirable circumstances, but rather the elimination of the emotional resistance that clouds judgment and wastes energy. When you stop requiring the world to be different than it is, you can see clearly how to change what can be changed and how to adapt to what cannot be changed. You stop fighting reality and start working with it. The business leader whose major product launch fails does not waste time lamenting this outcome, but immediately begins analyzing what went wrong and how to recover. The athlete who suffers a serious injury does not spend months in bitter resentment, but quickly shifts to rehabilitation and alternative training methods. The parent whose child makes disappointing choices does not persist in futile battles, but adjusts their approach to more effectively influence long-term outcomes. This discipline transforms every setback into education, every failure into preparation for success, every loss into an opportunity to develop strength. The emotionally undisciplined person sees obstacles as evidence that life is unfair, that they are unlucky, that their goals are impossible. The emotionally disciplined person sees obstacles as the natural texture of reality and develops increasingly sophisticated methods for navigating around them. A third discipline is the discipline of action, learning to act based on principle rather than impulse, on strategy rather than emotion, on long-term consequences rather than immediate gratification. This involves developing what might be called response flexibility, the ability to choose consciously how to respond to any situation rather than reacting automatically based on conditioning. Most people operate with a very limited repertoire of responses. When challenged, they either fight or flee. When criticized, they either attack or withdraw. When disappointed, they either rage or despair. These automatic patterns make them predictable to others and ineffective in complex situations that require nuanced responses. The discipline of action expands this repertoire infinitely. It creates the ability to respond to aggression with calm questioning, to criticism with curious inquiry, to disappointment with strategic planning. It allows for responses that are calibrated to achieve specific objectives rather than simply express inner states. A master of this discipline might respond to an angry customer with sympathetic concern, discovering that their rage stems from feeling unheard rather than from any real grievance. They might meet a competitor's aggressive pricing with an innovative service offering that changes the entire competitive landscape. They might address a subordinate's poor performance with a development plan that transforms a liability into an asset. The key is maintaining enough emotional space between stimulus and response to choose consciously rather than react automatically. This space is created through the systematic practice of the first two disciplines: clear perception and aligned desire. When you see situations clearly and want what happens, you naturally have more options for how to respond effectively. These three disciplines work together to create what ancient warriors called the calm mind, a state of consciousness that remains perfectly still at its center while engaging dynamically with whatever challenges arise. The calm mind is not passive, but intensely active. It is not withdrawn from the world, but deeply engaged with it. It is not indifferent to outcomes, but completely focused on process. The individual who has cultivated the calm mind becomes extremely difficult to defeat because they have eliminated the internal conflicts that create external vulnerabilities. They no longer fight themselves while trying to fight their opponents. They no longer waste energy on emotional reactions that serve no strategic purpose. They no longer create unnecessary enemies through defensive behaviors or missed opportunities through paralyzing fears. Instead, they become like water, yielding when resistance is futile, flowing around obstacles when direct confrontation would be wasteful, striking with devastating force when the moment is right. They develop an almost supernatural ability to find the path of least resistance toward their objectives, not because they avoid difficulty, but because they do not add emotional difficulty to practical challenges. This transformation from emotional reactivity to emotional mastery represents nothing less than the evolution of human consciousness itself. It is the difference between being controlled by life and learning to direct life. It is the gap between being a victim of circumstances and becoming the author of circumstances. It is the distance between existing as an effect of other people's actions and operating as a cause that shapes other people's realities. The man or woman who has destroyed their weak self has eliminated the primary source of human suffering, the insatiable demands of ego, the endless requirements for validation, the constant fear of loss or change. What remains is not an empty shell, but something far more powerful, pure consciousness, undimmed by the clouds of emotional reactivity, capable of seeing clearly and acting effectively in any situation. This is why the calm always wins. Not because they avoid conflict, but because they engage in conflict without internal division. Not because they feel less, but because they are controlled by their feelings less. Not because they care about nothing, but because they are not attached to any particular outcome strongly enough to be paralyzed by the fear of loss. They have discovered the ultimate secret of power, that the person who needs nothing from others cannot be manipulated by anyone. They have achieved the highest form of strength, the ability to remain themselves regardless of external pressures. They have developed the most sophisticated form of influence, the capacity to change others simply by refusing to be changed by others. In a world where most people are controlled by their emotions, the emotionally sovereign individual possesses decisive advantages in every arena of human activity. They see opportunities that others miss because others are blinded by feelings. They solve problems that others cannot solve because others are paralyzed by attachments. They inspire loyalty that others cannot command because others are too needy to be worthy of loyalty. But, perhaps most importantly, they experience a quality of life that remains mysterious to the emotionally undisciplined. They live in a state of continuous inner freedom, regardless of external circumstances. They find peace in chaos, strength in adversity, joy in simplicity. They have discovered that happiness is not getting what you want, but wanting what you have. That security is not controlling outcomes, but accepting whatever outcomes arise. That love is not receiving validation, but giving value. This is the ultimate victory, not over others, but over the internal forces that make victory over others necessary. The person who has conquered themselves no longer needs to conquer anyone else. They have achieved the only form of power that cannot be taken away, the only form of wealth that cannot be lost, the only form of security that cannot be threatened. They have become, in the deepest sense, indestructible, not because they cannot be killed, bankrupted, or defeated in particular battles, but because their essential nature, their consciousness, their dignity, their inner freedom, remains intact regardless of what happens to their body, their possessions, or their external circumstances. They have found the one treasure that thieves cannot steal, the one fortress that armies cannot breach, the one kingdom that cannot be conquered. This is the true meaning of Machiavelli's insight. The person who destroys their weak self cannot be destroyed by others because they have already survived the only destruction that matters, the dissolution of everything false, weak, and dependent within their own nature. What remains is imperishable, unshakable, and ultimately triumphant, not because it conquers all opposition, but because it needs to conquer nothing at all. The weak self dies so that the true self can be born. The false self is destroyed so that the authentic self can emerge. The dependent self is eliminated so that the sovereign self can reign. This is not loss but liberation, not death but resurrection, not defeat but the ultimate victory, the conquest of the conqueror by himself, the mastery of the master by his own highest nature. In the end, this is why emotional control is power and why the calm always wins. Because they have already won the only battle that matters, the battle for dominion over their own soul. Everything else is merely the external expression of that internal victory, the natural consequence of having become truly free.